All right, so you know how we're always digging into something on this show? Research papers, historical accounts, that sort of thing.
Right.
Well, today we're tackling something with, well, a bit more punch to it.
Oh.
We're diving into the government's case against former President Trump.
Serious stuff.
We've got this motion from special counsel Jack Smith, and it lays out their arguments, specifically focusing on what went down after the 2020 election.
I've got to say, it's not every day we get to unpack a document with this much potential legal and historical weight behind it.
You're telling me it's unprecedented, really. So our mission today is to break down this motion, pull out the most important pieces, and really try to grasp what it all means. Because this isn't just some dry legal document, it's a story.
Oh, I like that.
A story about power, about the potential abuse of power, and what it all means for the future of American democracy, you know?
Big question. So where do we even start?
Right. Well, maybe with the core of the matter.
Okay.
Give us the gist.
At its heart, this document is laying out why the government believes Trump's actions weren't just him being a sore loser.
Yeah.
They're saying he crossed the line into criminal activity, alleging a deliberate scheme to overturn the election results to hold on to power.
A scheme. So not just a disgruntled candidate, but a calculated effort.
That's their argument.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds a little. What's the evidence? What are they bringing to the table to support this scheme claim?
They go into meticulous detail about Trump's actions.
Oh.
Across several key states he lost, mind you.
Which one?
We're talking Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the whole 9 yards. They're claiming Trump and his allies, they put pressure on officials in these states, trying to essentially change vote counts,
Wow.
trying to overturn the actual legitimate results.
So they're laser focused on these state-level efforts, building a case for a coordinated pressure campaign?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And get this, they don't just throw out vague accusations.
Okay.
They give specific examples. Like in Georgia,
Sure.
they describe how Trump got personally involved,
He did.
contacted Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger directly,
No way.
and pressed him hard to find, quote-unquote, enough votes to flip the results,
Oh, wow.
even hinting at potential legal trouble if Raffensperger didn't play ball.
That's incredibly serious. To pressure an official like that with what sounds a lot like veiled threats.
Right.
But there's something else that I find interesting.
What's that?
The document goes to great length to emphasize that, despite all of Trump's claims about election fraud,
Yeah.
he never actually reached out to the election officials in those very states he was contesting, to ask about any potential issues or irregularities.
That's a really interesting point. You'd think if someone truly believed that there was widespread fraud, they'd be all over that, right?
Right.
Trying to get to the bottom of it with the people who actually run elections.
Exactly. It seems like a pretty big oversight. Unless, of course, like you said, the goal wasn't to uncover the truth at all, but to muddy the waters enough, create enough chaos to justify holding on to power.
And it doesn't stop there. The government alleges that Trump and his co-conspirators, they took it a step further.
Further, how so?
They were trying to put together this group of fraudulent electors. Basically, individuals who would falsely claim to be legitimate electors for the Electoral College.
Hold on a second, because I'm not sure everyone's clear on how the Electoral College works.
Sure.
It's not a straight-up popular vote, is it?
You're right. It's a little complex. But the simple version is it's the system we use to elect the president. Each state gets a certain number of these electors based on population.
Right.
And in most states, whoever wins the popular vote there gets all of that state's electoral votes.
Okay, so I see where you're going with this.
So this alleged plan of Trump's to use these fraudulent electors, it was an attempt to bypass the will of the voters and potentially swing the Electoral College in his favor.
It's like something you'd see in a movie. This maneuvering, these tactics, it's all about grabbing power by any means necessary.
And the document is very clear. These weren't just backroom dealings.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that Trump used his platform, his public image, to push these claims of a rigged election. We're talking speeches, tweets, media appearances, a full-on public pressure campaign, all designed to make people doubt the election.
Which leads us, of course, to January 6th, the Capitol riot.
Right.
The document brings up Trump's speech that day, where he made those same election fraud claims that had been debunked, by the way.
Right.
And then he told his supporters to march to the Capitol. You can't ignore the timing of all that and the chaos that followed.
And it's crucial to remember what was happening that day. Congress was meeting to officially count those electoral votes and make the election results official. Usually this is just a formality,
Right.
but Trump saw as one more chance to overturn the outcome.
And that's where former Vice President Pence enters the picture, right?
Exactly. The document goes into detail about how much pressure Trump put on Pence, pushing him to use his role in the process to somehow invalidate the results.
Which, and I think it's important to remember this, even some of Trump's own supporters weren't okay with. It just felt wrong, like it went against everything they claimed to believe about democracy.
And that's what makes this next part so striking.
What's that?
The document points out how, even after Pence told Trump directly that he didn't think he had the authority to do what Trump was asking, Trump kept at it, publicly pressured him.
It speaks volumes about the lengths to which Trump was allegedly willing to go to keep his grip on power, even if it meant pressuring his own vice president to disregard the Constitution.
And this is where things take a very interesting turn. They argue all of this, everything we've discussed, weren't the actions of a president performing his duties.
Oh.
They were the actions of a private citizen, a candidate desperate to cling to power.
So they're saying he was acting as a private citizen, even though he was literally the president at the time. I'm not a legal expert or anything, but that seems like a tricky distinction to make.
It is, and it all boils down to presidential immunity.
Ah, there it is, the I word. Everyone's talking about it.
Yeah.
But in plain English, what does it actually mean?
So the Constitution gives the president certain legal protections while they're in office. Basically, it shields them from being sued or prosecuted for certain things.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want the president constantly bogged down with lawsuits, unable to do their job.
Exactly. It's meant to ensure they can carry out their duties without being hampered by, say, frivolous lawsuits or politically motivated charges.
Right, because that could paralyze the entire country. But like with most things, I'm guessing there are limits to this immunity, right? It can't be a get-out-of-jail-free card for anything and everything.
You're absolutely right. And that's the million-dollar question at the heart of this whole thing. Did Trump's actions fall under legitimate presidential immunity, or did he step outside those boundaries?
And the government is saying he went too far.
Precisely. They're building a case for why his actions weren't protected.
So how are they doing that? What's their argument for why Trump wasn't acting within the scope of his presidential powers?
They point to the Constitution itself, which gives states the power to run their own elections.
Right, states' rights, that's a big one.
The federal government, including the president, is supposed to have a very limited role in that process. In fact, they bring up how much the Founding Fathers worried about a president abusing their power to mess with elections. It's a fear baked right into the foundation of our democracy.
Makes sense. The whole system falls apart if one person can just ignore what voters want and hold on to power.
Absolutely. The peaceful transfer of power, it's fundamental. And the document argues that by allegedly trying to interfere with those state elections, putting pressure on officials, even meddling with the Electoral College.
They're saying he wasn't acting as the head of state, but as a private citizen trying to game the system.
Exactly. A candidate desperately trying to hold on, even if it meant undermining the whole system. And get this, to really drive their point home, they bring in historical examples.
Oh, I love when they do that. It's like a history lesson and a legal thriller all rolled into one.
Right. They even quote Abraham Lincoln, who, during the Civil War, of all times, acknowledged that a president shouldn't be sticking his nose into state elections.
So they're saying this idea of presidents staying out of elections, it's not new. It's been there all along.
Exactly. It's woven into the very fabric of our country. And to make it even more powerful, they say they couldn't find a single example in history of a president trying to do what Trump allegedly did.
It's like they're saying, look, this has never happened before, so there's no way it's covered by presidential immunity. It's a pretty compelling argument, but what about Mike Pence? The document acknowledges that Trump's conversations with Pence were likely official acts because they involved Pence's role in certifying the election. Doesn't that poke a hole in their whole argument?
It's not that straightforward. They acknowledge the conversations were likely official acts, but they argue that going after Trump for those specific actions wouldn't actually harm the presidency or create a dangerous precedent.
That sounds like a tightrope walk. How do they justify that?
They break it down. They look at the vice president's role in the electoral count, which is very limited, largely ceremonial. They're saying Pence was more of a moderator in that situation, not someone who could single-handedly overturn the results.
So they're drawing a distinction. Trump's broader attempts to overturn the election, those were outside his authority. But his interactions with Pence, while inappropriate, weren't a threat to the executive branch as a whole.
You got it. They're saying, yes, those conversations were technically official, but not in a way that damages our case.
So they're really in the weeds with this, focusing on the specifics of each action to build their case.
It's a bold strategy, and who knows if it'll hold up in court. But here's the thing. This whole thing is about way more than just legal definitions and technicalities. It gets at something much deeper.
What do you mean?
This case forces us to look at some uncomfortable truth about our government. What happens when someone with immense power is willing to exploit the limits of that power? That's what's at stake here.
This whole thing, well, it's a lot. It feels like something out of a movie, not the United States.
I get that. It makes you question things, right? Our system, this idea of a peaceful transfer of power we've always had, this document, it's like they're saying we were closer to a full-blown constitutional crisis than any of us realized.
It's a heavy thought. And it brings me to the big question. Why does this even matter to the average person? We've gone through all the legal stuff, the back and forth, but what's the takeaway for someone listening at home?
This case, it's not about just one man or one election. It's bigger than that. It's about our institutions, our commitment to the rule of law.
Okay.
It raises huge questions. Accountability. Can a president be held accountable for things they did in office? Especially if those actions, if they really did try to undermine our system.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, especially with all the legal nuances, presidential immunity, separation of powers, all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And whatever happens with this case, it'll impact how we view the presidency going forward.
It's like a defining moment.
Right.
What's acceptable behavior for a president? What's in place to stop someone from abusing that power?
Big questions we all have a stake in. And honestly, this whole thing, it's a wake-up call. A reminder that our system, yeah, it relies on norms, on tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be ready to hold people accountable when those norms are broken.
Exactly. It's not a spectator sport, this democracy thing. So where do we go from here? What if all these allegations, what if they're true? Proven in court.
It could spark some much-needed conversation about presidential power, how to strengthen our elections so this doesn't happen again.
Protect the vote.
Right. Maybe even some legal reforms to make those boundaries of presidential immunity crystal clear.
It's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
Between having a strong leader, someone who can get things done, but also making sure that power can't be abused.
And this whole thing, it boils down to one thing. Yeah. An informed, engaged public. People asking questions, demanding accountability from our leaders.
Holding their feet to the fire. Well said. This deep dive, it's been, well, a lot to process. This motion, it's about more than just legal stuff. It's about the very heart of American democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've covered a lot of ground. From those specific claims of election interference all the way to these huge issues of power, accountability, what's next for our democracy. But like always, the deep dive doesn't end here.
Right. Keep digging.
Go read that source material for yourselves. Keep those questions coming, because the future of our democracy, it depends on it. Until next time, stay curious.